Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's Top 10 Film Festival Movies of 2016. So this is a change of pace from my normal videos where I tend to cover like science fiction, fantasy, action, suspense, comic book movies. I decided, hey, why not cover some indie movies? Because I'm actually a fan of indie movies as well, as sometimes they can be much better than the mega Hollywood blockbusters because they often don't have pesky studio execs interfering, or at least not as much, and are more often made by individuals who have a true love of the story that they're trying to tell, and everyone involved tries to tell the best story that they can rather than being a movie by committee, as many of these big blockbusters tend to be. So recently, the New Zealand International Film Festival came to the city I live in, which it does every year around this time, but typically I don't bother going because I'm too busy or I don't have enough money. But this year I decided to stop making excuses, so I went and saw 11 movies. So since I love top 10s, I decided to do a top 10 of the movies I saw. Now, because it's the New Zealand Film Festival, you may be thinking it's going to be mostly New Zealand movies that have nothing to do with you because you don't live in New Zealand. But remember, it's the International Film Festival, so the majority of the movies I saw were actually from the United States, and you probably heard of or possibly even seen some of these movies. I also saw movies from Germany, Denmark, Argentina, and of course one from New Zealand because I had to see at least one New Zealand film. I did also see a bunch of New Zealand short films in the film festival, but I won't cover those in this video and stick to the feature films. Now, some of these films may not have come to your area, while others may have come out a long time ago and are on DVD by now. But I'm counting all the movies I saw at the film festival, even though some of them may have technically come out in 2015. I don't care. If I saw it there, it's eligible. And there's a wide range of genres of the films I saw there, from comedy to suspense to romance to crime drama to science fiction to family movies to war dramas and some combinations thereof. However, I did steer clear of documentaries as I don't really care much for them anymore. So because I love to form everything in the form of a top 10, let me get started by counting down the top 10 movies I saw at the New Zealand International Film Festival. However, as you may have noticed, I mentioned I saw 11 movies at the film festival, so that means there is one movie that will not make my top 10, which I will call the worst film festival movie of 2016. So let me start with that one, and that is Equity. Equity is a film covering women in Wall Street, starring Anna Gunn, best known for her portrayal as Skylar on Breaking Bad. The acting in this movie was superb, and I can't fault it, particularly Anna Gunn, who was superb as the leading lady of the film. The problem came in with the script that was pretty dull throughout, and when it looked like it had the potential to be good, it ended up going nowhere in an ending that made me feel like I wasted my time watching this movie. The moral of the story seemed to be Wall Street is corrupt and greed always wins the day there. Yeah, no shit, Sherlock. Next you're going to tell me the Pacific Ocean is wet. Look, it's fine to have an obvious moral as long as you tell it in an interesting way and offer something new. This movie does not at all do that. So my rating for Equity out of 10 is a 3, very poor. I'd actually say that because this is the worst movie I saw at the film festival, I chose wisely which movies to see, because sometimes I'm really wary of seeing indie films because some can be incredibly boring and pretentious, but thankfully I didn't come across any movies like that, so I say I selected well, as in the big scheme of things this movie wasn't all that bad and I could have seen much worse. So now let me get into my top 10 film festival movies of 2016, starting with my number 10, Toni Erdmann. This was one of the more popular films at the film festival, a comedy from Germany about an eccentric father visiting his 30-something daughter who's become a, stuck-up businesswoman trying to survive in a dog-eat-dog corporate world, and the father injects himself into this world with comedic effect. And this movie did make me laugh quite a bit, and I do think there was a good movie in there somewhere, but honestly, it was way too long. It clocked in about 2.5 hours, where really I lost interest in this movie after the first hour. And after that point, it felt like it was just dragging out, and I was just waiting for it to end. There were a few funny parts in the second half of the film, but I don't think they justify the movie going on for as long as it did, and the ending didn't seem to resolve anything, and overall I didn't really see the point in why it needed to be as long as it did, other than cheap laughs, or getting across the simple premise that his daughter needed to lighten up, which I think it got across in the first hour. However, it was a really enjoyable movie, and it did have well-rounded, interesting characters. So my rating for Toni Erdmann out of 10 is a 4 poor. Coming in at number 9 is Swiss Army Man. This film stars Paul Dano from Looper and 12 Years a Slave, and Daniel Radcliffe, best known as Harry Potter, and is about a man stranded on an island who comes across a dead body that farts so much he decides to ride the farting dead body like a motorboat across the ocean to get back home. And that's only the first 5 minutes of the film, and it gets even more absurd from there. Many people loved this film and many people hated it. I heard at one of the prestigious film festivals it was screened at, half of the audience walked out before the movie was over, whereas many other critics proclaimed this to be one of the best movies of the year. Me personally, it was a bit too over the top for me. Part of this film was enjoyable, and I can definitely appreciate the master craftsmanship that was involved, as the way this film was shot, edited, and acted was really top notch and something to be admired, and the film was quite funny at times. However, this movie literally lost the plot, as it just became too ridiculous as the film went on, and this film was definitely not as meaningful as it tried to be. I understand it was going for a metaphorical story, kind of like Lost Highway, which I love that movie, but I didn't think it really pulled it off that well, and the main message behind it was all too clear and didn't really require all that farting to get, to relay this message. I just see the ending as a failure, but it wasn't an altogether bad movie. There are parts of it that really worked and worked well. It just didn't hold together throughout. So my rating for Swiss Army Man is a 5 average. Number 8 on my list is Le Clan, the Argentina film that tells the story of a family in the early 80s that kidnapped people to hold a ransom and would often kill the victim regardless of whether or not the ransom was paid. So the father, who is the mastermind of it all, is a pretty despicable man, but the rest of the family was more or less a normal family, with the son, who is a big rugby star, and I thought this movie did a good job of playing his doubts at what his father was doing, but he ultimately went along with it and helped him to kill a whole bunch of people. This was a really suspenseful movie and really succeeded in setting a dark tone, as it told the story of a seemingly normal family with a dark secret. The problem with this movie, I think, came in and it got too bogged down in trying to play the contrast with the normal family and the murderous kidnapping side, as it would often have this bubbly, live, happy music playing over scenes where people were being kidnapped or murdered. And while I'm typically a fan of that contrasting style, and indeed thought it was pulled off really well here, I did think they overdid it, and it became the primary focus of the film, and they failed to actually have a coherent or tangible plot that held everything together. Instead, it became a string of shocking scenes thrown together, hammering the same point over and over again of how a normal family has a murderous side. That being said, the characters in this film were believable and really well developed, and I found the ending of this film to be quite powerful, so my rating for The Clan is a 6 good. Number 7 is Chronos Stasia, which is a New Zealand film that I mentioned that had its premiere at the film festival I went to, which had a Q&A with the filmmaker who wrote, directed, edited, and starred in this film. Indeed, I learned that the entire crew of this film consisted of 2 people, which I gotta say shocked the hell out of me, because watching this film it came across as having just as high as production value as other full-length indie films which had higher budgets. In fact, in terms of craft, this film impressed me more than many other New Zealand films, those with $1 million budgets, where this film is described as having a zero budget. It's a science fiction romance centered on a main character whose consciousness travels to the future while he's sleeping. He meets a woman who he forms a romance with. He also meets an old man at a bus stop who is searching for his lost love. These people and other characters are the focus of his visions, which are ultimately affected by his actions. First off, I gotta say, I enjoyed this movie a lot more than I did many other New Zealand films, which I feel try too hard to be all artsy, which more often than not only succeed in being pretentious and boring me to tears. This movie was a very interesting science fiction, which to me reminded me a lot of one of my favorite movies, Donnie Darko. I loved how it really can't be defined in any one genre, and it manages to stay entertaining and engaging throughout with a pretty solid plot and cast of characters. But most of all, the strongest point of this film was the central romance between the 2 main characters, which had a lot of charm to it and I felt really worked, and is mostly what held my interest throughout this film. However, parts of this movie did seem a tad bit contrived and too much like a stereotypical adventure movie, and the ending in particular didn't seem to pay off the time travel elements all that well, and it felt a tad too convenient to me how every character introduced in this film ended up playing a major part in the plot somehow. And as I said, for the most part, this film had outstanding production value, particularly considering its low budget. There was one scene in this film, however, that had really bad sound where you could barely hear the dialogue, which was the only scene that made it feel a tad bit low budget or amateurish. So honestly, I feel that they should have either simply reshot or cut that scene out entirely, as it was the only scene that didn't live up to the high quality of the rest of the film. But overall, I see this as a huge accomplishment, and because it was self-funded, I could break with the traditional conventions that New Zealand Film Commission tend to hold to its films, which frankly I think held them back from appealing to wider international audiences, where this film is far more relatable and very unique rather than being like every other pretentious artsy wannabe film. So if you ever get the chance to see this movie in your area, I'd highly recommend doing so, as I found it definitely to be worth watching, and it's a huge accomplishment that a film with a zero budget and an on-set crew of 2 people would make it higher on my list than many of these multi-million-dollar movies. So my rating for Chronesthesia is a 7, very good. On to my number 6, which is Green Room. Green Room is a thriller/horror starring 2 Star Trek alumni, Jean-Luc Picard himself, Patrick Stewart, and the late taking from us too soon, Anton Yelchin. And it tells the story of a minor punk rock band desperate for money, taking a gig at an unknown venue in the middle of nowhere, and it turns out to be a white supremacy club. After witnessing a murder, they become trapped in a green room with the neo-Nazis led by Patrick Stewart trying to kill them. So this was a very interesting premise with a really well-rounded and a lot of fleshed out characters. And I got to be completely honest, this film had me on the edge of my seat and like tightly clutching the arms of my chair the whole time. It was super intense and gritty, and the ending was satisfying and equally dark. My main issue with this movie stems from the fact that I am not a fan of the horror genre, for the exact reason that it tends to feature the same predictable cliches, and unfortunately this movie does that as well, with the all too familiar plot of the protagonists dying off one by one until there's only 1 or 2 left. And to be honest, I never like movies that do that. The only one exception is Aliens, which gets a pass because it's one of the greatest movies of all time. Otherwise, it comes off to me as an obvious trope and it takes me completely out of the movie. In fact, one of the movie's biggest strengths is that it has a strong sense of realism, as these characters are no action heroes and they act the way that normal people like you and I would act if they were thrust into an intense situation like this. And for me, that's what really had me hooked and invested. However, this was undercut by the aforementioned tropes. However, I can't deny that this was one of the most intense movies I've seen in a very long time. So my rating for Green Room is a 7, very good. Coming in at number 5 is Everybody Wants Some, Richard Linklater's latest film that many are billing as the successor to Dazed and Confused, and honestly it does pretty much play out almost exactly the same in basic terms. However, this film follows a college baseball team on the first days of school in 1980. Now, typically I could go either way with Richard Linklater. Some of his films I love, like Waking Life and Tape, and other films I found incredibly boring and dull, but I won't name names. Boy! So I wasn't sure where I'd go with this one, because one thing about Richard Linklater is he's not a fan of plot or typical narrative structure and more likes to capture reality. And personally, I'm a huge fan of the narrative structure, and I get enough reality in real life, and I don't really need it in my films. So the lack of plot or narrative in this film was indeed an issue for me. However, I do think that this was entirely overcome by the rich and interesting characters, and more than any other film about the 80s that I've ever seen, it makes you feel like you were actually there living in those times, which were vaguely familiar to me as I was a little kid in the 80s, although only 1 year old in the time in which this movie is set. But I still found the atmosphere somewhat familiar, but it lets you live it through these the eyes of these college students who were really relatable as people. I never once found myself bored during watching this movie, and it did have me pondering over it for days after I saw it, which is always a sign of a good movie, but still I would have liked the plot. So my rating for Everybody Wants Some is a 7, very good. Getting down to my favorites, let's get to my number 4, which is Midnight Special. This is the one movie I saw at the film festival that felt less like an indie film and more like a big budget blockbuster, at least in terms of action and special effects. This film stars Michael Shannon and Kirsten Dunst and is about a small group of people trying to get a young kid who apparently has special powers, including being able to heal people and to hear all these radio signals, trying to get him to a certain destination by a certain time, while the FBI, NSA, and a deranged cult all tried to hunt them down and stop them. Now, first off, I want to address the most common complaint I heard about this movie, and that is that the third act reveal was rubbish and ridiculous. And if you hear critics say this, do not listen to them. This is utter horseshit. The third act reveal was amazing and totally in keeping with what has been established. This movie was something truly amazing and special, not only suspenseful and intense, but also at times really touching, as the love Michael Shannon and Kirsten Dunst's characters had for this young kid really shined through, as did his abilities, which as a sci-fi fan myself, I found interesting as hell. And the music in this film is definitely worth mentioning, as it is amazing and adds to the emotional punch that this movie has. But, and now you know it's time the negatives are coming, the one gripe I had with this film, which I felt held it back a bit, is the entire time I was watching this movie, I had this sinking feeling I was missing something. It's almost like there was a missing hour at the start of this film that I missed, and that the film begins when you're just thrust into the middle of the plot. In other words, the film forgot to put a first act in there, and it started in the middle of the second act. Apparently, some people like this, but I did not. Even now, looking back on it, it still feels kind of like half a film and not a full film. And the catch up that they tried to get to you, get you up to speed, I don't think it was good enough. And even Kirsten Dunst's character, who was introduced a bit later in the film, seems to like just come out of nowhere with no real introduction. It's just like all of a sudden she's there and all of a sudden she's a main character. And that's a shame, because had this been fully developed, I think this could be one of my favorite films of all time. But as it stands, it feels only like half a film to me. However, this movie reminded me a lot of one of my all-time favorite films, John Carpenter's Starman, and in a good way. And this is a movie I'm dying to see for a second time, which is always a good sign. So my rating for Midnight Special is an 8, extremely good. Coming in at number 3 is A War. This Danish film stars Palu Asbæk, if I say that right, which the synopsis of the festival plant list describes him as the Game of Thrones star. I don't know if I call the guy who plays Euron Greyjoy a star, as he only appeared briefly in 2 episodes, one in which he said, "Let's go murder them." In fact, after watching this film, I see what an absolutely amazing actor he is, and makes me even more upset that he's being so misused in Game of Thrones by given these cheesy lines and barely appearing. A War tells the story of a family man who's the commander of a unit in Afghanistan, and to be perfectly honest, the plot of this movie doesn't even start until the halfway point of this film. So describing the plot almost feels like a spoiler, so I won't really get into it. And yes, that is the biggest downside of this film, is that the first hour seems dull and pointless because the plot doesn't actually start until halfway through the movie. But that being said, once it does kick in, all the stuff you saw in the first half becomes extremely meaningful and relevant, as you learn it was all laying the groundwork for what was to come. And what did come was just really amazing. However, I do still feel that there were some unnecessary scenes, and the scenes, some of them were unnecessarily long. However, I do think that this is overshadowed by the power of the story, which is amazing because it really makes you question what truly is a war crime, as you find yourself cheering for a man accused of ordering a bomb strike that killed women and children. It really makes you examine the whole function of war and all of the gray areas that are involved. It was a really powerful, thought-provoking theme with strong characters that was just pulled off so well. It was a truly remarkable film. So my rating for A War is an 8, extremely good. So my second favorite movie that I saw at the film festival this year, making it my number 2, is Love Song. Love Song tells the story of a young mother of a toddler who's lonely because her husband is away on an extended business trip. Her high school best friend comes to visit, and they end up having a fling. So typically I'm not a fan of slow-paced slice-of-life movies, but for some reason this one really resonated with me, and I was hooked and intrigued throughout. Maybe it's just me, and this just struck a personal chord, but I found myself thinking about my own personal life throughout this film, even though the main plot is not something I've ever experienced. It's just this sense of realism was just so strong and powerful. It goes beyond what you see in most films, and unlike some slice-of-life movies like Everybody Wants Some, this film actually does have a plot, and one that was executed really well. This film also explores the nature of human relationships beyond labels and beyond preconceived societal notions that make you examine how we really do relate to one another as human beings. And again, it does it in such a realistic manner, which makes it even more powerful as you really get inside these characters' heads and feel what they feel. I read this one review that was saying that they felt the dialogue was as interesting as a pile of dirt, but that's because it was realistic. When people talk in real life, they don't have fancy dialogue. They just say, small talking bullshit, and this film actually did that in an interesting way that served the plot, so I was really impressed by it. Even though it was slow paced, I was never bored at any point in this movie, and by the end of it was completely overwhelmed with emotion, which is something only the best movies can do. So I have to say I was really touched by this movie. So my rating for Love Song is a 9. Excellent. So now we get to my number one favorite film festival movie of 2016, and that is Captain Fantastic. Captain Fantastic stars Viggo Mortensen as the father of a very eccentric family as he raised his 7 kids in isolation in a forest with no electricity, where they are completely self-sufficient and they hunt their own food, they create their own shelter. Also, the children have a strict reading regime as well as a strict physical regime, so as a result they are very intelligent and very fit. But due to their isolation, they are also very socially awkward. When their mother dies, they go on a mission to crash her funeral, in which their grandfather said they are not welcome to. So it turns into a fish out of water story as they have to deal with society at large, which they have spent their whole lives being isolated from. So let me get my personal bias out of the way, as I knew people who wanted to live similar lifestyles, maybe not to this extreme, but I myself was considering something to a lesser extent at one point. But I've read a lot about philosophies similar to what this family practices, and I completely agree with the way of some of their thinking, such as the form of schoolless as education. So it was completely fascinating for me to see a movie that explored this. In fact, a lot of their philosophies I agree with, but they take it to an extreme that I wouldn't. But taking my personal bias out of it and judging it strictly as a movie, this is brilliantly plotted from start to finish. Not only was I never bored with this film, I was completely enthralled. It did kind of remind me of other classic indie comedies such as Little Miss Sunshine, but personally I think this movie was much better. And this movie was funny throughout. It doesn't actually glorify this family's particular philosophy, as it shows the downside of it as well. So I think even those who may not agree with them will still be entertained by this movie. And the cast of characters were just so rich and believable, and their character interactions were so real and relatable, and they never sacrificed them by using typical Hollywood tropes. But the story was really touching as well, as at the heart of it was about learning to cope with their mother's death. And Viggo Mortensen really shines in this film. I dare say this is the best performance I've ever seen him give. This is a film that I definitely want to see again, as I do think that this all worked perfectly and was masterfully crafted and a truly unique film. If the Oscars weren't all about politics, I'd say this was a shoo-in for Best Picture nomination, but since it is, I kind of doubt it, but we'll see. So my rating for Captain Fantastic is a 10, the best. Now, I said before in another video that I, give 10s out to films very sparingly, and if I do, that means it is eligible for my top 50 favorite movies of all time, and this film most certainly is. But I have to give it some time to think about it, see it again before I decide where exactly it falls. But I definitely would recommend seeing Captain Fantastic at your very first available possibility. So that's it for my top 10 film festival movies of 2016. Be sure to check back here next week as I count down my top 10 summer blockbuster movies of 2016. Also, be sure to check out my channel for many more videos on shows like Game of Thrones, Star Trek, Mr. Robot, Dark Matter, and more. And be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.